Iron City built. It's time for the Steel City Nation podcast. Here's your host, Mark Mariday.
I'd like to introduce my guest this evening, the legendary reporter, sporting news columnist, Michael DeCourcy. He covers NCAA basketball. He's been doing it for 25 years, and he is good at it. Michael, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. And actually, I've done it 25 years for sporting news, but before that, I did it at the Memphis Commercial Appeal and at the Pittsburgh Press, covering the Tigers when I was in Memphis, and then, of course, the Pitt Panthers and Duquesne Dukes when I was in Pittsburgh. So it goes back really more than 30 years, my association with covering college basketball. And it's been a wonderful time. It's exactly what I would have dreamed of doing when I was a teenager, growing up, going to Elizabeth Forward High School. And of course, when I went to Point Park, one of the things I talked to a sports writing class at UT Chattanooga last week, a friend of mine who teaches there. And I spoke to them and I said, look, I can't tell you anything about how to get into the industry now. It's just so completely different from when I started, which was early 80s.
Yeah.
What I can say is that this past basketball season, I had 3 jobs that I would consider to be dream jobs. I was studio analyst at the Big Ten Network, sporting news college basketball columnist, and the bracket analyst for Fox Sports college basketball telecasts. I did all 3 of those during the season. And when I started, none of those jobs existed. There was no Big Ten Network. Fox Sports did not exist. They were not doing NFL. That's where they got started in NFL, but that didn't start until I was well into my career. And of course, sporting news was a going concern when I was young, no question. But they didn't even. They were mostly a freelance outlet when I grew up reading the sporting news in the 70s. Great columnists like my friend Art Spander, he's covering his 85th Masters in a row this weekend. No, it's not really 85. I think it's 50. But can you imagine that? He's still going. It's crazy, right? But I remember when I was a teenager at Elizabeth Forward, reading Art and the great Joe Falls and Dick Young. And I read all those sports writers, but they were all daily writers for newspapers. And then they do a column a week for sporting news. So that job didn't exist either until basically the dawn of the internet.
Sure.
So all of that has been, a gift to my career. The opportunity to do those things has been wonderful. And like I said, things I couldn't have imagined doing when I was at Elizabeth Forward working on The Warrior as a sports editor.
My favorite thing about reading sporting news, it was a newspaper. It wasn't like any other magazine. It literally was a newspaper. I used to subscribe to that when I was a kid. I would beg my father and mother, hey, would you please give me the sporting news? When I knew my subscription was going to be up, I'd start egging them on. Hey, renew that for me, please. But I always enjoyed it. Great columns, great insight. It just seemed to dig a little bit deeper about the sporting world than what you get out of the regular newspaper. And that's what I love most about it. Even to me, more than Sports Illustrated. I was never a big Sports Illustrated guy. I was a sporting news guy. So love the stuff. So my sources tell me that you're a Hall of Famer at Elizabeth Forward. I know where Elizabeth Forward High School is. My brother used to live in Morgantown. We used to travel down through that area to go down to Morgantown. So I know exactly where it is. I saw that shrine there one time. Didn't quite put 2 and 2 together until we talked. What did you play in high school? What was your sport?
Well, I'm a Hall of Fame person at EF, not because, and the irony of it is technically I am in the sports category. They put me in as they put it like businessmen and physicians, and my college roommate, who's one of the great orthopedic surgeons in Western Pennsylvania, was in the same class, Hall of Fame class as I was.
Yeah.
So I'm in the sports category, and all these great athletes that I grew up alongside, who went on to fantastic things. Brian Holton, a year ahead of me in school, pitched for the Dodgers in the '88 World Series and won a World Series ring. And he's not in EF Hall of Fame, and we got to get that fixed, right? But He also should be in the WPIAL Hall of Fame, and I've worked a little bit on that, and we haven't made a lot of progress yet, but maybe one of these days we'll get that done. I was not an athlete in high school at all. I played, I think my last technical interscholastic athletics was I played on the 8th grade football team. I have a ton of I have such great stories from playing a year of 8th grade football. And this is true. I was 4th string. There were 2 players on 4th string. That's because there were enough guys for a 1st string, 11 for a 2nd, 11 for a 3rd. There were 2 guys left over. I was not the worst on the team. The other guy who was on 4th string was worse than me. But one of the guys on 3rd string later developed and played for the Steelers, Pete Rostowski. And he became a starter at left tackle for the Steelers, and played in the AFC Championship game. I believe it was '85. Started at tackle for the Steelers. So it's amazing how people now, like if your kid's in 9th grade or whatever, and they aren't being seen or noticed, people, parents get a little upset. Pete was not even a starter in 8th grade or 9th grade, and then he developed physically, and he grew up. And he went to UConn and became, a very good player there. And the Steelers signed him as an FA, and he wound up starting some games for I think for a couple full years he was a starter. So it's amazing how that's one of my fun stories from 8th grade football. I won't bore you with any more.
That was great though, because let's think about the greatest athlete to never make his high school basketball team, and where he is today. When you're talking Michael Jordan. So he's a prime example of, you just got to keep persevering. It's funny to hear that. I have kids. I teach high school for a living. This is my side gig, like you have many side gigs. And we have many kids whose parents just beat down the door of our head football coach, head basketball coach, whatever. My kid should be going here or going there. And it's like, your kid needs to earn that. And if your kid didn't earn that, he needs to go wherever he wants to go and make a name for himself. It's just that's what we preach. And I know Pete's parents probably weren't beating on the head coach's door. He just earned them for himself, right?
Absolutely. I think his family had a farm, and throwing bales of hay around and all the rest of the stuff that you do on a farm, physical work. From the time he was, like I said, one line ahead of me. Now he was a year younger than I was, but as a 7th grader, he was only one line ahead of me on the offensive line. And then all that work, he grew up. He went to college as a much bigger person. He was a great player in his senior year at Elizabeth Forward on a terrific team that I think went 9-1 in the regular season and made the playoffs. And so that from there, he ultimately went to UConn and had a very successful career there.
That's great. Hey, what was your claim to fame? What got you into the Hall of Fame then? And how did you
becoming a national sports writer at Sporting News, that's the success I had with that got me in there. That was I got in 2003, so that was well before I did television at Big Ten Network or anything like that. It was the success I'd had at Sporting News. So very blessed to be in that company. There's a lot of wonderful people in there. But like I said, we got to get a few more of the jocks in there. We've had some great athletes at EF, and not enough of them are in there, or for my taste. I've got to get working on that harder than I have been. So eventually we'll get some more of those. I know Bill Robinson, the great baseball player for the Pirates in the '79 World Series.
Absolutely.
He's in as an athlete, but they need some more.
Especially when you talk about somebody who played on that '88 Dodgers team. That was the last Dodgers team to win the World Series. Am I correct?
That is correct.
Handed swing. I'll never forget
Yes.
that game.
He pitched in that game, came in the 5th inning, I think it was. Starting pitching didn't go great. He came in the 5th inning. I believe, if I remember correctly, I know he pitched to Jose Canseco, and got him out. And so that was a huge part of that win. And he didn't pitch in any other games. That the starting pitching really picked up after that. I think Hershiser pitched, if I remember correctly, 2 complete games, so they didn't need middle relief help. But he did contribute significantly in the playoffs against the Mets, and then in that game 1 victory over the. Hey, if he doesn't come in and get Canseco out with guys on, if I remember correctly, that Gibson home run doesn't become the moment that it became.
Mike, he's kind of counting on you now to help him get in the EF Hall of Fame. You know that.
Got it. I like I said, I have done some preliminary work on trying to get him in the WPIL Hall of Fame. And then, of course, I brought it up last year and didn't get as far as I hoped. And then the pandemic happened, and the folks at EF had a lot of other bigger concerns than that at this point. And I totally get it. And, in concentrating on athletics, they had the boys soccer team make the WPIL semis, and the football team, the women's soccer team, girls soccer team made the playoffs, didn't last as long. And then the boys team is playing in the WPIL finals. First time in school history, they are in the WPIL finals. So really excited about that Friday night. That'll be cool. I'm going to try to find an internet connection where I can watch. But the first time in school history is really an amazing feat for them, and the first undefeated regular season as well. Really cool moment for Elizabeth Forward.
How long has Elizabeth Forward had soccer? Because I know when I look back, I went to Kiski area, so just down the road from you guys, basically. They didn't get soccer till probably like 20 years ago. Like, we didn't have soccer growing up.
Didn't have soccer when I was there, but I remember going to a WPIL playoff game at Upper St. Clair that involved EF while I was still working in Pittsburgh. So that probably would have been either late 80s or early 90s.
Yeah.
I was still in Pittsburgh because I lived out that way. So I just popped over to the game. It wasn't as long as, for as far away as soccer seemed when I was growing up in the 70s from many of us, that they jumped onto it pretty quickly. They haven't had it, they don't have a powerhouse program, but they've been pretty good. They've been pretty successful. And of course, this year, one of their best teams ever.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, let's get into a little meat and potatoes here. Let's pick your brain a little bit. Let's start with players to watch in this 2021 NCAA season. Who you like? Give me some guys that I should be watching for when I click it on here in not too distant future.
Well, it starts with Luka Garza at the University of Iowa, who was the Sporting News Player of the Year for last season. We were one of 2 or 3 organizations that named him Player of the Year last year. The pretty common player, the one who won the most of the major trophies, was Obi Toppin at Dayton, and we didn't have any problem with that. But we looked at Luka Garza at Iowa, went up against a series of terrific big men in the Big Ten, probably the deepest group of big men that any conference has ever had. Daniel Oturu at Minnesota, Kofi Coburn at Illinois, Penn State had Mike Watkins, Maryland had Jalen Smith. There were so many terrific big men. And Luka, against all of those players, just continued to power through and produce. I think he finished the year with 9 consecutive 20-point games. His numbers were amazing, and he drove what is not a significant defensive team to an outstanding season, a very successful season at Iowa. He decided to come back to Iowa. The entire team just about at Iowa is intact, and they're getting a lot of top 5 recognition. AP, some of the other preseason prognostications are putting them around the top 5. They have to improve defensively to live up to that. They've been an elite offensive team, one of the 2-3 best in college basketball, but a pretty ordinary defensive team. So he has to improve some himself. Around him, I think, has to improve even more. But he's going to have a great year. No, as long as he stays healthy, he's going to have a great year. He could have gone overseas and played professional basketball and made a lot of money this year. But he wanted to come back to college basketball and have a season and have a successful season. And honestly, I think that given the sacrifices that some of those players have made, I'm really hopeful that teams, that the leagues and everyone will try to give them the opportunity to have a season. Jared Butler at Baylor, a terrific scoring guard who has a great perimeter shot, really physical player, can drive the ball past you or through you. Kind of built like somebody that you'd want to have play strong safety for the Steelers to an extent, but he's a hooper and a terrific player. Decided to come back as well to a Baylor team that, again, last year they were kind of a surprise. This year they won't surprise anybody unless they don't play well. They're loaded and should be outstanding. There's a young man named Cade Cunningham, and he's a freshman at Oklahoma State. I think he's the best of the freshmen who are entering college basketball. And Cade is a point guard, 6'5" or so point guard, has great ability, played for the United States in the under 17 World Championship last summer. There wasn't much international hoops this summer, but last summer played for them and was exceptional, really successful player, and won a gold medal. And he'll be outstanding. The problem is that you may not get to see Cade play in the NCAA tournament because Oklahoma State, as part of the basketball corruption scandal of 2017, Oklahoma State was one of the schools that had an assistant coach who was arrested in that group. And so their punishment has already been handed down. And frankly, I think for what little they did not have a lot of involvement. That person had not been on campus there for very long. I think that they got handed a too significant punishment to be banned from the NCAA tournament. And I believe Oklahoma State is still in the process of appealing that penalty. And I'm still hopeful it will be overturned so that you can see Cade not only in the Big 12 season, but also in the NCAA tournament.
How does Sean Miller continue to escape the swirling rumors around him and doing some things that he shouldn't be doing with college basketball?
Well, I think the first thing you need to understand about Sean's circumstance is that the NCAA is only within the last 2 weeks or so presented to them the notice of allegations of what they said Arizona did wrong. And again, he also had one of his assistant coaches arrested in that case. Nothing has been affirmatively tied to Sean, but he did have a staff member, as I said, who was in that circumstance. And the notice of allegations that Arizona received, most often when you have a circumstance like that, the school is going to look at it, give it a good once over, see if they need to redact any names. Usually the NCAA redacts names at first, but the school has a right, if they're releasing it, to redact names as well, where they feel it's fit. And unfortunately, the University of Arizona has chosen not to release it at all, at least to this point. And eventually they may have to, but they're choosing not to release it. So we don't know what's been alleged to have gone wrong at Arizona basketball. We only know that something has. And so it will take some time for all that to work itself out. And it'll take some time for us to find out whether anything has been alleged against Sean that would warrant him losing his job. But when this all started back in the fall of 2017, Arizona's then new president and then new athletic director were very supportive of him. And I think that initial decision to support him has led them to continue supporting him. And I think they will continue to do that unless there's something in that document that says they shouldn't, or something in an eventual NCAA finding that says they shouldn't.
Let's go back to the freshmen. Let's rewind just a second. Besides the young buck from Oklahoma State, what other diaper dandies are coming in to keep an eye on this year?
Well, as always, when you look at, you kind of start at Kentucky. They always have some terrific players that are freshmen. They really rely on it, and the best, the one that we expect will be the best at Kentucky. His name is Boston. He's a 6'8" wing, a very gifted player, very dynamic. BJ, he goes by the name BJ. I've seen him listed between 6'6" and 6'8". but a really dynamic player that you can expect to have a great impact on Kentucky. Florida State, Pitt fans will, I assume, eventually see Scotty Barnes, who is signed at Florida State. The Panthers have had some success against Florida State. Very few other teams in the league have, but the Panthers have played Florida State pretty well since entering the ACC, and they'll see Scotty Barnes, again, another really gifted player around 6'7", plays both forward spots, a really dynamic guy. And of course, very few people teach their guys to defend as well as Leonard Hamilton does. Southern California has a big guy named Evan Mobley. And it's funny because when I believe his father's name is Eric. Okay. And I saw that, I'm like, oh my, I covered Eric Mobley. Well, it's a different Eric Mobley. So they SC hired Evan's dad to be an assistant coach. And then Evan followed him to SC. And he'll be a freshman there. And they lost a lot from a terrific team a year ago. But having a great player like Evan coming in will really help them. Texas has a freshman named Greg Brown, a power forward. Be interesting to see what they do with him. A really talented guy. A lot of very good big players have gone to play for Shaka Smart and haven't blossomed. I think Shaka's a terrific coach.
Yeah.
But yet to see evidence that he does great things with great big men. And so this is a real challenge for him. I mean, he took it on. He's a local kid. Greg is a really talented guy, big body, great dynamism. And so I'll be very curious to see what kind of freshman year he has.
Sounds like the Big 12 might be a pretty powerful conference this year based on some of the things you're saying early.
I think that what hurts them a little is that Kansas has a little bit of retrenching to do. I think they'll still be very good, but from last year's number one team, lost a lot. Need to find a point guard, need to make sure that they're handled up front. And so we'll see. And then I do think Oklahoma State will be much better. But the real strength in terms of depth of great teams in college basketball is in the Big Ten. And I say that, that little asterisk, I work for the Big Ten Network, but it's not why I'm saying that, because I could have and would have told you in 2018 and did tell you in 2018, if you're watching BTN, that the league wasn't great. That year, not great. It was not an outstanding season for the Big Ten. Had a team win 13, I believe, Big Ten games and didn't get into the NCAA tournament. And although they could have been, no one said they should have been. If they had been taken, no one would have said, well, that's an embarrassment. But there wasn't much fight about the fact they didn't get in,
right?
Because they didn't win enough tough games. And so when I tell you that this past year in the Big Ten, they were outstanding, and this year could be just as good and in some ways better than a year ago, that you know that I'm being frank and honest. Now, they may not live up to what they're capable of, but with what they brought back in terms of talent at the number of schools that they did, it's a really deep league. There were 7 in the AP preseason top 25, 7 Big Ten teams.
Wow.
Should have had Indiana. I'm not saying they should have had 8, but if somebody that was one of their teams had been replaced by Indiana, or I don't think anybody would have said, what are they doing there? So it's a really deep, powerful league. Should be very entertaining. Really looking forward to a season and talking about it on BTN. Should be and eventually, like a year ago, I believe my final projection for Fox had 10 Big Ten teams in it. And I'm not sure whether they'll get 10 this year, but I think the ones that they do get, there'll still be a bunch. I think the ones that they do get will be higher on the bracket than last year's teams.
Will Penn State continue to build on their success? They were having a nice run last year.
Well, Penn State, unfortunately, found itself in the position of needing to change coaches in the offseason.
Happened, right?
There was a report that came out in an ESPN publication called The Undefeated that Pat Chambers had used a particular phrase that a player that he used it with found to be offensive. They did an investigation of the circumstance. It took a long while because that article appeared maybe in July. And they investigated, they gave it a good look, even to the extent that I believe they'd already begun practice when they ultimately decided that they needed to make a change. So the person in charge of the program now is Jim Ferry, the former coach at Duquesne and Long Island University. Jim is a terrific offensive basketball coach. And so he may be able to energize the offense. The offense was never great under Patrick Chambers. The defense was always great. I think this past year they were very good offensively because they had very good players. Lamar Stevens, the best of them. Losing Lamar will be a big difference. But if ever there was a year to put Jim Ferry in charge of your team, this was a good one because their four best players are all guards, all perimeter type players. So they can take a really dynamic approach to the game, maybe play a little bit more up tempo than Penn State is used to playing, than the Big Ten is accustomed to seeing. There are only a few teams that play really fast in the Big Ten. And so that may help them find a way forward. The difficulty for them is that in a year where they are losing one of their all-time best players in Lamar, and then having to make a head coaching change on the eve of the season, you're going into the league, as I described, that is extraordinarily deep and powerful. So it's going to be very difficult for the Nittany Lions. I wouldn't say they can't, but I would say that if they did, it would be a surprise.
Any other rookie or first-year coaches that are going to be coming into the NCAA this year that are going to make a change, a difference, somebody that's going to be pretty impactful?
Well, I think the first thing you need to remember is that there were very few coaching changes in the offseason as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, sure.
Fewer than ever before. I mean, when I say ever, I mean ever in my career. And so, and that goes a long way. So it's not all of college basketball history, but it's a good chunk.
Yeah.
So I think the one name that you can look at is Steve Forbes at Wake Forest. Wake Forest really struggled the last 3 years or so. They've lost a lot of talent. I'm not sure and when I say they lost a lot of talent, they had two players transfer to other major programs, including a young man named Olivier Sarr, who transferred to the University of Kentucky and will be eligible to play for the Wildcats and will play as probably UK starting center. So they lost a lot, but eventually I think Steve will do a good job there. He's a terrific coach. Did a great job at East Tennessee State, as a great job in junior college when he was, I believe it was Northwest Florida State. I think that he'll do a nice job rebuilding Wake Forest, but that's a very difficult job. In a 14-team, 15-team ACC, there's so much less oxygen in that league than there once was, and so programs like NC State, like Wake Forest, that used to trade on the exclusivity of being in the ACC. Hey, you want to play Carolina Duke? They don't want you. You want to play against them? Come play for us.
Yeah.
Now 13 different schools can sell that.
Yeah.
So it's a lot harder for them. They have passionate followings, and Wake's a great university, but it's a tough job because of it being a small private school in a league whose greatest powers, with the exception of Duke, are mostly big state schools with all the amenities.
Sure. Any veteran guys out there who potentially could be, I don't want to say hot seat just because COVID has wreaked such havoc, as you said, but any veteran guys who maybe they're starting to tail off in their career, if they don't get it done this year, they move on, or they might be casually pushed out the door?
I'm one who never talks about hot seat. I've always declined to write about it, to talk about it. I'm willing to say so-and-so needs to do a better job. Their program needs to pick it up a little bit. Things aren't going the way that you want them to, that sort of thing. I don't think that's unfair. I think that one person that it would be fair to say that about would be Josh Pastner at Georgia Tech, but they seem to be on the move upward. I mean, a year ago, they finished 11-9 in the league, fifth place in the ACC, 17-14 overall. I think they need to do a better job in non-conference play. They need to be a better home team than they've been. But, Josh, when he was at Memphis, I've known Josh since he was a teenager. I met him at the Nike All-American Camp in 1993, I believe it was. And Josh was a high school player, but he wasn't a great one. And I didn't understand really in watching him why he was at the Nike camp. But Sonny Vaccaro invited him there because he was basically a basketball savant. And he thought it would be good to have Josh there as a result of that. He's the only player in years of covering those summer camps that when the game was over, he stayed in the gym to watch the other players. And so you knew he was going to be something in basketball, whether it was a college coach or somebody's GM in an NBA, he was going to be something. And he's been, he was a very successful assistant coach for Lute Olson at Arizona, and then for John Calipari at Memphis. But I thought he was kind of stubborn about the way he built his coaching staff at Memphis, and I thought it hurt him. And he corrected those mistakes when he went to Georgia Tech. And now it's just a question of getting the talent and the maturity of the program moving in the direction that he needs. And I think he has that now. I think Georgia Tech's going to have a good year. I think they have a good chance at making the NCAA tournament. So when I say he's got to do a better job, I think he's done well in building the program forward. I think the Georgia Tech people are going to want to see results. And I think this is a year, if we have a semi-normal season, in which they might want to see those results. But I do think that they are going in the direction that they want to be going at this point.
I could see a school like Georgia Tech having a shorter leash on their basketball coach than on their football coach, to be honest with you. Just over the years, just watching it and seeing how things transpire, I could see that happening. So hopefully for his sake, he can put it together and keep moving forward. Any traditional powerhouses going to struggle this year, unlike any other year? COVID maybe had some impact on their recruiting or their commitments, or maybe guys that could have stayed left. What are we looking for there?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that where I would look first in that regard is to the ACC again, and what is North Carolina going to be coming off of their worst season under Roy Williams? They were 6-14 a year ago. I think they move significantly forward. I don't think that they're going to have another year like that. But in order for them to move forward, someone in the ACC is going to have to move back, right? I mean, somebody's going to have to finish 14th if the Tar Heels aren't going to do that.
Sure.
It'll be a challenge for Louisville. I still think they're going to be an okay team. I think they'll be fine, but they're in a sort of a hammock year in between what was a really good team a year ago with some veteran players and what will be a terrific team a year from now if everybody in the program stays patient. That they're going to be really good a year from now. But this year, are they good enough to be what Louisville has come to expect? A year ago, they were 17-1 at home. They finished 15-5 in the ACC. They played some really, really good games. They're very successful in a lot of ways. And so I think that I think it's going to be hard to match that season, a 24-7 season. Obviously, we're not going to play 31 games unless they make the Final Four, in which case this is not going to be a problem. Right. But I think that it'll be tough for them to match that level of success. I don't think they're going to be plunging back down to what Carolina did a year ago. That was a bad confluence of circumstances for the Tar Heels that led to last season, including an injury to the player Cole Anthony, around whom they built their entire team. But I do think they might fall back a little bit toward the middle of the pack in the ACC.
Let's cast your, which I'm sure you've already done, let's cast your preseason top 10. Who do you like from 10 to 1?
Ooh, I have not done that yet. I owe that to Sporting News, and I have not done that. But I will tell you that I'm considering 3 teams probably for the number 1 ranking, and that would be Baylor, who I mentioned before, Villanova out of the Big East. Villanova has another great team, a lot of talent, a lot of depth, and then Gonzaga, which is the story of Gonzaga is the most amazing story of the past 20 years in college basketball. What's interesting about it to me is I remember very vividly when they made the Elite Eight, beat Florida in the Sweet 16, played UConn tough in the Elite Eight. I remember that team very well. And then the head coach, Dan Munson, who was in charge of that, went to work at Minnesota, and Mark Few took over. And I went to play in Mark's golf tournament in 2003. And when I was there, Rick Barnes was there, Steve Lavin was there, Jay Billis was there. So I was pretty small potatoes on the guest list. Gary Williams, if I didn't mention him. I mean, so when I look at what's happened at Gonzaga, it's amazing. But then I think back, like he already had it going. It was only 2003. I mean, he already had it lit. The fire was lit in just 4 years as a head coach. Yeah. He already had sort of shown to everybody that he was somebody that you wanted to know, that he was somebody that was going to do big things. He had me over to dinner. I stuck around after the tournament to do a piece on Gonzaga and on Mark. So he has me over to dinner. He was living in a little, a very small, modest house at that point. And from there, he's just as he has gone from there to a very lovely house on 10 acres near Spokane. He's taken the program from a very modest, hey, we're the best team in the WCC and we're dangerous in the NCAA tournament, to a national power that is capable of competing for national championships, played in the title game in 2017 and could very well be back this year. It's remarkable what they've been able to achieve out there. And they've done it with Mark being about as normal. Look, basketball coaches are normal people relatively, and in comparison to football coaches, sure, basketball coaches are pretty normal, but he takes normal to another degree. If you saw him at the grocery store, you wouldn't be surprised, and you'd never know that he was the head coach of maybe the number one team in college basketball.
That's pretty amazing to hear that. It's been fun. I'll be honest with you. It's been fun watching them just kind of escalate, like you said. Like, as a college basketball fan, I'm not surprised anymore when I see them in the top 10, in the top 5. It just doesn't shock me anymore. It's fun to watch them be there. I think that's what sets basketball aside from football from that perspective, where you're not going to see, let's just take Cincinnati, for instance, right now in football. They are spectacular, but they're never going to catapult over a Notre Dame, a Clemson, something like that. You need a lot of dominoes to fall. Whereas in basketball, it's a whole nother ball game. And that's what's really captivating about it, at least from my perspective. And I'm sure from yours, you wouldn't have been doing it for all these years.
Yeah, it's one of my frustrations with football is that, I've written a number of times that football does not have a legitimate championship. They call it a playoff. It's not. It's an invitational. You only get to play if they invite you. It doesn't matter what you achieve. They don't have to invite you. Cincinnati could finish, I don't know how many games they're playing, let's say 10-0 this year. They could win every one of those games by a significant margin. It won't matter. They won't get invited. I say that as someone who has a real fondness for the program. I lived there for 18 years. I went to home games there. My wife and I watch a lot of their games, almost all of them, frankly, on television. And so I say that with resignation more than dismissal. I don't believe that's how it should be. I have written on many occasions that a real championship in college football does not need to expand more than to 8 teams, but you need to have the champion of every Power 5 conference. You can't be dismissed having won a conference championship. That just can't work. Right. Then you have 2 at-large teams to take in Notre Dame in a year when they're not in a conference, as well as a significant, successful team from a power conference like a Alabama in a year when Georgia's great or whatever. And then 1 team from the other 5 conferences, whoever happens to be the best in that year. And that in this particular year would be Cincinnati. And people who argue against that, when I've written it, say, well, how do you know there's going to be a team good enough? Well, I mean, you look at every year since there's been a playoff, and there's always somebody. Western Michigan under PJ Fleck, before he went to Minnesota, was 13-0. They would have belonged. Central Florida, the most obvious example, I believe that was 2017, when they were undefeated. That clearly belonged in the right sort of playoff. Am I going to argue that they got hosed because they didn't get to go that year? Under those rules, they probably should have gone, but under those rules, I can't argue that, because it's not really about a true championship. It's about a television show. Sure. They don't take, all the people who are on The Bachelor or The Bachelorette are attractive people, but that's not the 20 best looking people in America. It's just 20 really good looking people that they could get to come on the show.
Exactly.
That's the way it is in college football. They get the 4 teams that they want to have that are going to draw the biggest crowd. And they're probably the 4 best, but they aren't necessarily. The people who ascribe that to them, that, these are the 4 best teams. If everybody could tell, I always say this, if everybody knew who the best teams were all the time, we would all live in Vegas in very big houses.
Sure.
Simple as that. If you could identify anybody who always knows who the best teams are, that person, and put them in charge, that person would live in Vegas in a very big house. Most people who live in very big houses in Vegas sing and dance, or run the casinos. There aren't very many sports bettors. There are a few, but there aren't very many who are breaking the casinos. And the ones who can do that aren't sharing their knowledge with the college football playoff committee, that in order so they can protect themselves and continue to win bets. So it's a silly enterprise in the way that it's run. If they went to 8 teams, it would be a monstrous deal. People would love it. It would draw great ratings. When we can get back to having fans on, at stadiums, you put the first round at the home site of the higher seeded team. So that's another 100,000 crowd that you could gather. I mean, it all makes too much sense. College football is the most backward enterprise in terms of the way it's run at that level, the playoff level. It's driven me crazy for 40 years. It's not going to stop, because I maybe this will teach them that they need to expand it, but I'm not holding my breath.
Well, it's amazing you're telling me all this, because I was on another podcast recently and I had the same conversation, but I was speaking your voice, talking about all this. In the bottom line, somebody told me, and I already knew, this is the money. And I said, okay, so let's regionalize this stuff. So if Cincinnati's the number 8 seed and Clemson's the number 1 seed, they go there. You can slap a bowl name on that game. I don't care. That's not the bottom line to me. The bottom line to me is to see the 8 most competitive teams in America playing football for the national championship. That's another thing that diversifies, and this, basketball from football, whereas basketball takes all those teams, all those competitive teams, and you get a chance. And now you've got 2 playing games. So even if you weren't one of those 64, you still can be one of those playing games and get yourself in there. Who knows where you go from there? I agree with you 100% on that. The NCAA has got to fix that at some point. They have to. But you've got to have the right board of regents and governors to buy into all that in order for them to not be driven so much by the mighty dollar, but the mighty outcome, in my opinion.
Yeah, I college football, like I said, is a very stubborn deal. It took us 50 years from the start of the AP poll until the Bowl Alliance happened. And then I don't know exactly how long, 8 or 9 years before they came up with the Bowl Championship Series. And then it took another 15 years or whatever to come up with the college football playoff. So progress comes really slowly. And I do think that ultimately that you'll see what I'm talking about. And I don't know that it'll necessarily ever go beyond that, at least certainly not while I'm around. But I think we'll eventually see it. I just think it takes too long. What I argue about in regards to the college football playoff is that they're not taking every qualified team, and they should never have a championship in which you don't have every qualified team. You can argue that basketball has more than the sum total of teams that are qualified, but you can't argue that they exclude anybody that's qualified to play for a championship.
Right. I agree 100%. All right. Give me your conference champions. I know you got your conference champions.
Well, there are 32 conferences. So which conference, where do you want me to stop?
Give me your ACC, your SEC, give me your Big Ten. Tell me your biggies. Yes.
Well, so let's start with the Atlantic 10, where I think Richmond is the dangerous team. Since the Dukes are in that league, I think the Dukes are going to be pretty good, but I think Richmond is the team to beat. The Dayton will be very good. St. Louis will be very good. The Dukes will be a threat. Rhodey, I wouldn't rule out them as well. But Richmond, I think, is a team that is very scary and should be really successful. Virginia, this is the first time since 1982 that Virginia was picked by the preseason media poll, I think it is, to finish first in the ACC. I'm going to concur with that. They bring back a lot of what made them another excellent defense a year ago, and they've added some offense as well. So I think they'll have to fight off Duke. I think Duke has a chance to be really good, but Duke's got two freshman guards that they're relying on. They can't have them both not be outstanding. They have a young man named Jordan Goldwire, who is a really good backstop option to play point guard, and they may use him at play three guards at the same time. I think both guards have to be outstanding for Duke to have a shot at winning the ACC title. Big East, as I mentioned before, I believe Villanova to be the best team in that league. Not by a significant margin because Creighton's very good, but I really like that team. Without a schedule, it's hard to say, and there are a lot of contenders in the Big Ten, but I'm going to go with Wisconsin because they're the most reliable team to me. The fewest moving parts, so to speak. They know exactly who they have to be good because they were that team, and then they have all the same players. They were that team for the last month and a half of last season, and so they know exactly who they need to be. They have great chemistry. They have a great formula. They're going to face really significant challenges from Iowa, Illinois, Rutgers, Ohio State. Michigan State are all going to be terrific. But I think that those teams will all, I think, ultimately yield to Wisconsin. In the Pac-12, a really tough call, but I'm going to go with UCLA. Arizona State's going to be very good. Oregon's going to be very good. Mentioned SC before. Stanford has a chance to be special. Watch out for them. They've got a great freshman named Zaire Williams. If he makes the transition quickly, they may be the toughest team, but UCLA brings a lot back from the team that dominated the last portion of last season, and I like what they're building there. And I'm going to go with Kentucky in the SEC. They won the league last year by 3 games in a season that wasn't a dominant season for them. 3 games ahead they finished. I think they're going to do it again. They're going to be younger than they were a year ago. They still have some experience. I mentioned Olivier Sarr. They also have Keon Brooks, who was on last year's team and I think could be a breakout player. So I'm going to go with Kentucky in the SEC. And then I neglected to mention the American Conference, which I would say Houston would be the clear favorite in that one.
If I put you on the spot and I said, let's seed our top 4 number ones going into the tournament, who do you see coming out across the country from that perspective?
Yeah, I already mentioned 3 of them. And it conveniently, they spread geographically. In the West, we have Gonzaga. In the Southeast, we have Baylor. In the East, we have, as I mentioned before, Villanova. And then in the Midwest, I'm going to say for now, Wisconsin. Putting together a number 1 seed team with their talent might be hard, but if you win that league this year with the power that I've talked about being in the Big Ten, you may be deserving of a number 1 seed. So I'll go with them for the 4th number 1.
2 of my favorite teams you mentioned, Villanova. I was always a big Raleigh Massimino fan. I just loved watching the guy coach. As a kid, as I got older, I just admired his style. I also like Georgetown a lot, John Thompson. but I also like watching the style of basketball Wisconsin brings to the court. So it's exciting to hear that they're gonna be in the hunt hopefully again this year. I personally a big Pitt fan and a Maryland fan. I've lived in Maryland for over 20 some years. What can I look forward to there? Let me ask you this though, before I have you answer that. And I keep beating my head against the wall, hoping this doesn't happen. Is Capel going to leave Pitt if the Duke job opens up and go back to Duke?
My answer to a question like that is, if that happens, that's great news for Pitt, because they're not going to hire him off a series of seasons in which the Pitt is competitive but finishes in the bottom third of the ACC, which is what we've seen over the first 2 years. Now, that's no affront to Jeff at all. He took over a program that needed massive rebuilding, massive, and they just haven't broken through yet.
Right.
If he is desirable to Duke at the point when Mike Krzyzewski retires, then that means Pitt is great. Pitt, they're not going to hire the guy who finished 12th in the ACC. They're going to hire the guy who finished second and made the Elite Eight, or maybe squeezed into the Final Four, something like that.
Right.
So when that happens, you'll have enjoyed a wonderful ride, and you will be positioned to be followed, for Jeff to be followed by someone who looks at that job as an opportunity, not to continue a moving program and not a massive. This is a massive rebuilding job that like Jeff took over. So I think that's I never worry about that for any program. Xavier has lost this. Think about the coaches that Xavier has lost in the last 25 years. They lost Pete Gillen, who eventually took Providence to the Elite Eight. They lost Skip Prosser, who went and won an ACC title at Wake Forest over a North Carolina team that won a national championship. They lost Thad Matta, who took Xavier to the Elite Eight and eventually made a Final Four at Ohio State. They lost Sean Miller, who also took Xavier to the Elite Eight and has been in the Elite Eight multiple times at Arizona. So they've lost Chris Mack, who did great things at Xavier, got him to a #1 seed in 2018. They lost all those guys, and none of it has slowed them down. Because they identify who they want to be the next coach. They have an idea. Most of them have been in the program. Thad was an exception. And they've done phenomenal things through all that time. Every one of those guys had phenomenal success, went on to bigger and better, and they just said, okay, we'll get the next guy. We'll be good. We know how to run this. So for Pitt, hope that Duke wants Jeff Capel in a few years, however many years that is.
Yeah.
So I really believe that. I think that's a best case scenario for Pitt. And then maybe Duke calls and he says, I love Pittsburgh. It's the greatest city in the world. That's what I would say.
Yeah, of course.
Probably he wouldn't. But it's, better that he has that choice.
Yeah. That team, he has reworked that roster. He's let guys leave that even productive guys. He let productive guys leave that roster from last year, and he's brought in his guys. Are they gonna get to 500 this year? Are they going to be more productive? Do they have a chance at going to the dance? Where do you see them this year?
Well, I'm not sure that I necessarily would look at them as a tournament team at this point. They've been a step forwards, half step back kind of program to this point, and I think it's still probably about a year away with what they have, and some of that means that you need to keep the players in the program who have you a half step away, and not necessarily moving on. Xavier Johnson, Xavier Johnson is how he says it. I'm sorry about that. I think he's a player that's a 4-year player, and I hope that he embraces that, because if he does, I think that he can have a great junior and senior year. And maybe if this year doesn't turn into that magical year where the Panthers go back, I think next year will. I wouldn't rule out them possibly doing it, but I still think that they need a few more guys, a few more dynamic players to make that step. I like what they have, and I love their coaching staff. I think Jeff's terrific. It's a very deep league, and it's a very difficult league to stand out in because there's 15 schools in the league, and how many of them aren't basketball first? Syracuse is basketball first. All the old time ACC schools are basketball first. Boston College, I guess, is hockey first, and obviously Notre Dame is football first. But you're dealing as a football first program in a league where, Clemson, Florida State, Notre Dame, and then everybody else pretty much they put their first A game into basketball. So it's a hard climb.
Sure, it'll be exciting to see where they go. How about my Terps? What can I expect from them? Because, man, I had high hopes for them going into the tournament last year. Talk about a team that it just was sad that they didn't get to play. I really thought they were positioned to make a run.
It was sad because they had a great chance. I mean, they had a senior point guard and an All-America level big man in Jalen Smith, who was one of my favorite college basketball players of last year. And I said this multiple times on BTN. The thing that I loved about Jalen so much is I've watched as the game has evolved over the last 20 years and seen so many big players who complained about having to play the center position. I'm a power forward. I want to be out shooting the basketball. I don't want to have to deal with being pounded on or pounding on someone else. That's not what I want to do. I mean, I scores hundreds of those kinds of players.
Sure.
And Jalen was asked to take over that role on last season's team as I described before, that deep group of powerful, gifted, big players that was in the Big Ten, and never complained one time, never once, just went out every game and battled. Every game he gave it his best. He was terrific. And so to lose a player like that is really difficult to replace. And I don't know whether the replacement for that guy is on the roster. I thought when Shaul Marial came onto the scene late last season, that perhaps, there's some stuff there that others don't have. He's really nimble for a guy his size. He drifted back because Big Ten competition got so intense and he wasn't ready to make a difference. And so a lot of people started to get down on him. But when I watched him in those early games, he debuted on BTN late December, early January of last year when they were still playing non-conference games. And I had the studio that day, and I really liked what I saw. I thought there was a real spark there. I hope I'm right. I hope that he can be a significant contributor this year because the perimeter is really solid. Guys who've played a lot of basketball and won a lot of games, Aaron Wiggins, Eric Ayala, Daryl Morcell, made that huge shot at Minnesota last year that essentially won Maryland a share of the Big Ten championship. And in a year like 2019-20, that's really important because you left with something as a Terps fan. A lot of teams had great teams and thought, okay, we're going to get it in March. We didn't win this regular season, but we're going to make the Sweet 16 and we're going to be happy. We're going to make a Final Four run, even though we got nudged out for our conference championship or whatever. And none of those people ever got that chance. Maryland got to hang a banner, and a legit banner in a tremendous season. And all those guys that I mentioned were significant contributors to that. Dante Scott, that was a freshman last year. The question is, do they have the players to make a difference? I think Jarris Hamilton coming in as a transfer from Boston College, I think he can make a difference for them up front. But whether or not they have the guy to replace what Jalen Smith added. And again, in a lot of leagues, maybe you'd say they're fine. They got all that perimeter talent back, got enough big bodies to go bang, we'll be fine. But this is a year in the Big Ten where you have to be really good to win games because the teams that are winning games in that league are going to be really good.
Well, I mean, you laid it out there for us already. You could see 10 teams in the dance, so it's going to be a challenge for them. When you don't think they're going to be what you want them to be, they show up. When you think they're going to be something, they just play underachieving. So, Mike, if you weren't a sports writer, as you've been doing for all these years, what career path might you have taken?
Oh, well, that's really an impossible question for me to answer because I knew that I wanted to do this when I was in fourth grade. And
Wow.
I entertained no other options. And I was a pretty good student in high school. And I used to have teachers tell me, well, why do you want to do that? Man, I got a lot of that, more than I ever imagined that I would. And my father, I always tell people this, the last fight I ever had with my father that didn't involve me not cutting the grass on time was about me not wanting to take physics as a senior in high school. I knew I wouldn't need it to be a sports writer. I was tired of getting B's and C's in science and math and A's and B and all A's in history and English. So I want to take all history and English and get straight A's.
Sure.
So that's what I did. And he fought with me and he said, what if you want to be an engineer? And, we didn't have this saying then, but I wish I'd been able to say, did you just meet me? Because it was never a consideration. It just wasn't there. And when I got a scholarship to Point Park in spring of my senior year at EF, I got a full tuition scholarship to Point Park, and never heard another word from my dad about choosing the wrong career path. Once college was free, he was cool. And he didn't live long enough to see me on TV or any of that, but he did see me do, my first Final Four, a lot of championship fights, a lot of cool stuff at the Pittsburgh Press. So, he was able to, he left knowing that I was successful, and I wish he could have seen a lot of the cool stuff that happened later, but he did know that I had been successful.
We're a lot luckier in life to have you writing for us and covering all these games and being on the Big Ten Network. There's no doubt about it. Hey, I do a final segment. It's called Decade Definers. Share with me a couple of the best games you've ever covered throughout your career. A couple of top-notch games that just stick in your mind as long-lasting memories.
Well, some of the things that stick out to me, I covered the 1996 Olympics. And my assignment for Scripps Howard News Service was to cover boxing. And the U.S. boxing team had Floyd Mayweather on it and a few other guys who became great pros, and they all lost. The way Olympic boxing is scoring can be tricky for amateur boxers. And Floyd, I remember Floyd was, I bet if I saw him now, he wouldn't recognize me or anything. But if I saw him now and asked him about the 96 Olympics, I'm sure he'd still complain about the decision because he was really angry about it. But there was a young man named David Reed who was the last U.S. boxer to fight for a gold medal in that, and there weren't very many, as I recall, but he was one, and he was on the last day of the Olympics, and he was fighting a young man from Cuba, and he was getting absolutely obliterated. I mean, it was like halfway through the second round, it was over. I mean, the kid could never catch up, except it was boxing, and so you can knock your guy out. And David reached down and he found a punch, and it was like an uppercut, and he knocked the guy out with one punch. It was like, you've seen the Flutie pass and all the Hail Marys, it was that times 100, because it wasn't a close game that was won on a last play. It was a complete obliteration that was won like that. It was completely turned on its head by one punch. Never saw anything like it. I tried, there were a bunch of other, journalists who were there. I was trying to say, do you know what you just saw? And none of them understood what they'd seen. They didn't understand. They didn't seem to comprehend how you can't see that in any other sport. When Doug Flutie threw his pass in 84, that beat Miami, they were in the game. They were just losing. I mean, a touchdown pass won the game. So they were in the game. So it was a crazy ending, and you certainly didn't expect it. But David Reed was getting pounded. And he actually happened to be really close with the coach of the team, who was getting resoundingly criticized for finding a way not to win a gold medal with Floyd Mayweather. And so he ended up leaving with this great victory. And David ended up having a nice career before. I think he got injured or something like that, but had a nice career as a professional as well. So that's one that would stick out. I covered the 1987 Fiesta Bowl, the Penn State versus Miami game that was memorable for how heavily favored Miami was, how arrogant they were coming into the game.
Testaverde?
that was the Vinny Testaverde was the quarterback. They had Alonzo Highsmith on that team, Jerome Brown. It was a phenomenally talented team. And Penn State was great too. And Penn State was not as flashy. They did not have a great quarterback. John Schaefer was a winning quarterback. Never lost a college, only lost one start in his entire career as a quarterback. From junior high to high school to Penn State, only lost one start his entire career. That was the prior year's Orange Bowl national championship game. But he made enough plays to win that one. And I predicted in the Pittsburgh Press the day of the game that Penn State would end up winning 27-23. So I had the margin right, 14-10. I had the exact margin. It was a little bit less high scoring than I thought. When I watched the game live, the one thing that I didn't account for in the article, I think I really had the prediction right on. The thing I didn't account for was Penn State really struggled to block Miami's defensive line, Brown and others. They were great. Dan Cilio was on that team.
Yeah, I remember them.
Two, three other guys that were great. And they really struggled to block them. So that's why it didn't get to become as high scoring. But Penn State won the game. And that game, was a really memorable night to be at for someone who's pretty young covering sports for the Pittsburgh Press. The opportunity to be at the first game of the World Cup in 2014 in Brazil, that was not the best game I ever covered, but it was the greatest memory I'll ever have as a sports writer. To be in Brazil, which so cherishes the game. I flew on a red eye to get there. Got off got off the plane, took a cab to the hotel, had to immediately get on a bus because we had to get to the stadium so early to get in. It was the first game, all these dignitaries. So had to get there so early that I literally had to get on a bus as soon as I got there. So I got no sleep and went to that game. And when the Neymar for Brazil scored the first goal, he scored on a shot from outside the box that sort of trickled through a bunch of bodies, and the goalkeeper didn't get a good look at it, and it sort of sneaked in the inside of the post. It wasn't the most beautiful goal ever, but when it went in, there were fireworks all over Sao Paulo. Like off in the distance, we were way up on the top of the stands, and off in the distance over the top of the other side, you could see all these people setting off fireworks in their neighborhood. I will never forget that picture. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I mean, just the joy that they had for their team and that night and having the World Cup in their city. The opportunity to be in Brazil for that tournament was just breathtaking. It was just amazing. And that night will always top everything. The best game that I ever covered will always be, and I have no doubt that I'll retire knowing this to be true, was the 1992 East Region Final between Kentucky and Duke. 104-103 final. Christian Laettner, perfect 10 for 10 from the field, including the buzzer shot at the end of the first overtime on the pass from Christian Laettner. Just it was a breathtaking night for a basketball purist like me. It just was phenomenal. The people at the press knew how much I loved the game, and someone mentioned to me that when that game was going on and I was there, someone mentioned to me that back in the office they were all saying, "Oh, I bet DeCourcy is loving this," because it was really that kind of night. And it's an interesting story about my chance to cover that. I was assigned to cover the region, which was in Philadelphia, and I just had to drive over in the company car from Pittsburgh. And my assignment, my beat assignment then was Pitt, and Pitt was in the NIT, and Pitt was assigned to go play Penn State, and everybody thought they were going to lose the game. And in some ways, it seemed like it was a game that was taken to try to get Paul Evans a loss that they could fire him on. It didn't happen. They went up and played great and won the game. So then they played Florida at home. So what I needed to happen for me to get in the car and go to Philly was I needed Pitt to lose, and preferably close, so that there wouldn't be any repercussions relative to Paul's job status. And so I'm not saying I was rooting against Pitt. I was just covering it. But if they could lose and lose close, that would be good for me. And so the final score, I think, was 76-73 or 75-73, something like that. And Sean Miller had a last gasp half court 3-pointer to either tie it or win it. As I said, I don't remember the exact margin. He missed the shot and sort of just kept running right to the locker room. That was the last shot of his college career, last shot of his basketball career, because he went immediately into coaching. And so instead of having to get on a bus or plane or whatever, I was going to get to Purdue for the next round of the NIT. Next day, I hopped in the company car. I drove to Philly. And so I got to be there for Leitner's shot. And if they had won that dang game against Florida, I don't think I'd have been able to go.
I think that's one of those games that kind of like everybody remembers where they were watching that game. I mean, I remember exactly where I was sitting in a bar, but nevertheless, I'll never forget that. I was a big Bobby Hurley fan. Just, he was my guy. I liked watching him play, and that was fun. That was great. You've got some great memories in that career, and I'm sure you've got a lot left to come. I'll be watching closely, and I'm sure our listeners will be watching closely as this NCAA basketball season starts. And let's hope we have a tournament this year. It's always one of the greatest times of the year, in my opinion, to watch that happen. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's David versus Goliath a lot of times, and it's fun to see who comes out in that. So have a great season. Thanks for coming on, giving us all the preview, telling us what we need to look for. I hope to catch up with you again.
Oh, absolutely. I enjoyed very much. And for those of you who missed last year's tournament, I did a long piece, an oral history of the last great day of the 2019-20 season. That's on you can find it on my Twitter account now or on sportingnews.com about it's an oral history of March 7th, 2020, and what all went on that day. It was a crazy day of college hoops. And then what happened to all the principles of that day during the course of the next week as the tournament was canceled, et cetera. So hope you check it out. It's a good read. I had a lot of fun doing it. Talked to a lot of people who engage in college basketball, really love the game and put a lot into it. And so I think if you read it, you'll really appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing that with us, Mike. We'll be looking forward to watching the season unwind. And I'll make sure I get that little blurb there in our show notes so everybody can go check it out. Kind of put some culminating to what didn't happen for us last year.
Well, you bet. Thank you very much.
Take care.